Last month, a storm bore down on our small town, thick clouds roiling in a way that felt almost foreboding. It felt like that storm had crept right into my neighbor Lisa's home, too, when she staggered over to my porch, eyes wide and disheveled, clutching her phone like it was a hot coal. "I think I need to go to the hospital," she gasped, her voice a mix of desperation and fear, but it wasn't the words that sent a shiver down my spine, it was the way she said it, as though she was trying so hard to keep it together but knowing her grip on reality was slipping. I could see her young son, Thomas, peeking from behind the screen door, those big, innocent eyes wide with confusion, and suddenly that shiver transforming into a full-blown shudder as I imagined how scared he must be at that moment. What had started as a simple rainstorm turned into an unbearable weight swirling in my stomach. I hadn't had the best relationship with Lisa, she rarely reached out unless she needed something, and here she was, practically demanding I take care of Thomas just so she could feel free enough to leave. The storm rumbled ominously overhead, and I didn't want to find myself plunged into the chaos of her life, so I hesitated for a heartbeat too long before saying, but frankly, I couldn't even finish that one pathetic little word before she started begging, "Please, I've tried calling a babysitter, but they're all busy. I can't leave him. Not now." I could see that desperation and fear were mixing into a cocktail of urgency, and my insides twisted as I imagined the looming hospital visit, thoughts racing through my mind about what it might reveal. What if something terrible was going on? What if I said yes and it spiraled downward? I shook my head, feeling my resolve harden despite the fluttering anxiety in my chest. I told her, "I'm really sorry, Lisa, but I can't. I have plans." It wasn't a lie, my nerves had been frayed by last week's sleepless nights and the dreadful anxiety that came with the unknown. There was something inside me that whispered she'd find someone else, and while I pressed my lips together to silence it, it only amplified in the silence. Her face fell, anger momentarily flashing in those wild eyes before they pooled with tears, and just then as the wind picked up, a small rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, resonating the storm's resonance with her heartbreak. "You're a monster," she hissed, and although I sucked in a breath, ready to explain how I wasn't prepared for her chaos, the moment just shattered. "All I'm asking is for a few hours," she continued, her voice trembling. "What would you do in my place?" I realized this was no longer about me or my panic. I had to find what was beneath my refusal, what was the cost now that I had said it out loud. I could feel guilt creeping into the corners of my heart, coupling with my relentless anxiety. I had just locked myself out of something elemental. She twisted away from me, storm clouds roiling in her eyes as she retreated, that small hand of her son reaching for her, this sweet boy who didn't understand anything beyond a child's innocence. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more, that I would pay for my refusal. And just as I started to make amends with myself, an ominous message flashed on my phone very late one night. A simple text read, "Lisa was found." I felt an oppressive weight in my chest, burying me in doubt. The words "found" could mean anything, yet they stood stark against the solitude of night, intensifying my fear. I didn't even know how to process that, who to reach out to, or what else I might have caused when I had chosen my own comfort over that child in desperate need, the seed of anxiety sprouting into a relentless vine strangling my thoughts. I lost sleep, switched off my phone, and tried to quiet my mind as new pangs of remorse twisted inside. Until finally, the storm decision echoed back, shattering my solitude as I found the resolve to confront my cowardice. I trudged over to her house, the sky heavy with moisture, wind whipping at my clothes. I brought with me just a small bouquet I had cobbled together from my backyard. Upon reaching her home, though, dread built up the moment I caught sight of flashing lights against the windows, the police, their rigid figures silhouetted against the open door, spelling tragedy. A knot in my stomach deepened. I had worse fears about what had happened than I could admit. I stood rooted as I overheard snippets of a conversation. She was in some kind of state. "We'll get him out to safety," and in a shadowed corner of my mind, something thudded sickeningly as the implications crashed over me. I had known. I had known when I felt that chill in my gut, the heaviness of something grotesque awakening after I refused. Then, a small, familiar silhouette collided with my view. Thomas, hair tousled, eyes blurred with tears as he was led away, crying for his mother while the officers inspected his sad little figure. I could see the raw confusion wrapped around his expression like a shroud. I opened my mouth, but nothing emerged, my heart hammering in my chest as it dawned on me. She hadn't gone to the hospital because she needed to, she had been in an irreversible descent that I had just turned my back on, and that refusal now manifested a darkness I never anticipated, a helpless child standing dumbstruck in a storm of his own, and I froze under all the weight of it. The cries of a frightened boy saturated the evening air, buried deeper into a grisly storm of fate that had been intertwined with my choice, suffocating all rationality. A figure emerged, covering Thomas with a blanket, but all I could see were the words echoing back, reverberating inside me relentlessly, AITA for refusing to look after a child. And in that haunting moment, as I stood paralyzed among the onlookers, I knew the answer clawing at my insides like an uncontained beast, leaving me ash-gray with dread as I began to understand. It was a fight I had already lost. I used to think family dinners were sacred, a time when laughter echoed and memories were created, but that all changed when Uncle Greg, who has an uncanny ability to slip venomous remarks into jovial conversations, decided to comment on my smile. It was supposed to be a routine Sunday evening. My mother had spent the entire day cooking her famous lasagna while my father polished his collection of vintage wine, and the aroma normally brought me a sense of comfort. As we gathered around the oversized table, my mother's excitement was palpable as she presented the meal, her warm smile contrasting sharply with the chill that settled in the air as Uncle Greg leaned in, eyes glinting with mischief, and said, "What happened to your smile, anyway? It looks different." At that moment, a thunderbolt struck within me. My mind raced back to the summer I turned 14, the summer my childhood was ripped from me when I discovered Vine, a predator masquerading as a social media platform where I was the star of ridicule with a series of leaked videos that showcased my awkwardness and strange, crooked grin, dictated by the braces that had turned me into a target for the school bullies. Laughter had morphed into tears, and that distant, carefree girl was just a haunting memory as my smile had become a mask for my pain, a fragile shield behind which I'd concealed years of insecurity and self-loathing. I froze, feeling the eyes of my entire family on me. The youngest cousins were giggling by the dessert plates, my older sister was nervously flicking her gaze between me and my uncle, and my parents were exchanging worried looks, as if they could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface, the air thick with tension waiting to burst. Then, before I knew it, the acidic words were spilling from my mouth like a torrent. "What's wrong with my smile?" The table fell silent, forks paused midair, and for a fraction of a second, time felt suspended. Uncle Greg chuckled, half in jest and half in malice. "What happened to the girl who used to light up the room with that dorky grin?" I could see it then, the flicker of glee in his eyes as if my vulnerability nourished him. In that instant, the jubilant laughter of the evening faded into an oppressive silence, and with every ounce of grief I harbored, I vented, unleashing suppressed anger and frustration that spiraled into a whirlwind of words, attacking not just Greg but the entire facade of family gatherings, laying bare the scars that were traditionally covered with laughter. Do you think I want to be reminded of how different I am? Of the countless nights I spent crying in front of a mirror wishing to fit in? And as I spoke, it was as though a dam broke. My family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the shock of the sudden outburst tangling their hearts in conflicting emotions. My mother looked hurt, as though I'd pulled back the curtain on a family secret, while my father, usually the peacemaker, sat, wide-eyed, surprised at the tempest that had erupted from his adoring daughter. Then it happened. My sister, usually the calmest of us all, stepped in, her face pale as she bitterly remarked, "You're not a walking tragedy. Get a grip. This is just a dinner." The words snapped like a rubber band, ricocheting through the room and into every soul present. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. What was once an ambient family gathering had transformed into a battleground where everyone was armed with unspoken feelings. It felt surreal, our laughter replaced by an awkwardness thick enough to slice. I felt lost, standing amidst the wreckage of my own emotions, the insult consuming me, gnawing at my insides. I could see my uncle's pleasure, feeding on the drama he had awakened, and it infuriated me further. Why couldn't they understand that family should be a sanctuary, a place I could shield myself from the world's cruelties? And when I finally saw my father's gaze, a mix of pity and disappointment, I realized I had crossed a line that would never be uncrossed. The dinner plates were forgotten, the clinking of utensils was replaced by my heaving breaths, and the tension became palpable, everyone holding their breath, teetering on the edge of the abyss. Then Mom, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and sorrow, finally spoke, her voice trembling, "You've ruined this dinner, all of you. Greg, you need to learn when to keep your mouth shut, and you." She turned to me, disappointment etched across her features. You should know better than to let it get to you. We're family. I gaped, the weight of it hitting me like a freight train. I had acted out, sure, but so had Uncle Greg, yet somehow, I was the villain in this narrative. As the discomfort and hostility wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket, I felt detached, an observer in my own life, watching the family I once adored crumble under the strain of unaddressed grievances and unexpressed emotions. I stormed out, tears cascading down my cheeks as the darkened evening air hit me. I didn't hear the poker-faced exchanges or the strained whispers following my exit. I simply wrapped my arms around my knees under the stars, wondering if I had truly ruined the dinner or merely laid bare the fractures that had always lurked beneath the surface, awaiting the perfect moment to shatter our fragile facade. As the night wore on, the moon hung heavy with judgment, and deep down, I felt it, the feeling that perhaps we were all broken, cracking beneath the weight of unspoken words, yet desperate to pretend we were fine. But for one fleeting moment, amidst the chaos and heartbreak, I wished someone would have just acknowledged the depth of my hurt, instead of dismissing me as the antagonist of the family drama and making me wonder if, maybe, it was time to stop pretending those cracks didn't exist. The reality was, we each wore our own masks. Uncle Greg wore his of laughter while my family donned theirs of indifference, and that night, I unveiled mine, the one marred by hurt but precious in its truth, and I realized, maybe, the real tragedy wasn't in my smile but in the silence that had allowed them to linger. Last week, I found myself at the crossroads of familial loyalty and gut instinct, torn apart by my father's health issues and the shadow that loomed over his friend Walter, a man who'd slithered into our lives with charm and an unsettling undertone. My father, once vibrant and full of life, had been grappling with aggressive cancer for the past year, and despite the slowly thickening fog of despair that shrouded our home, Walter had introduced himself as a source of comfort under the guise of a devoted ally. I didn't think much of it at first. He showed up with handfuls of flowers, extravagant presents, and what seemed like genuine concern for my father's well-being. Every week, he called to check in, send uplifting messages, and even accompanied my dad to the very first round of treatments. But it wasn't long before I began noticing the little things, the way Walter would linger too long on the fringes of conversations, the crinkle in his smile whenever Dad mentioned me or my accomplishments, a creeping envy that spewed from his otherwise polished demeanor. The essence of his being wrapped itself around my father like an invasive vine, smothering his spirit while nurturing the insatiable thirst for control that lurked behind Walter's friendly facade. So when I found out that Walter had made plans to accompany my dad to his crucial 6-month checkup, a kind of distorted appointment that could either bring a glimmer of hope or the plunge into eternal darkness, my heart clenched tightly in rebellion. I dreaded the idea of relinquishing my protective post, of handing over my father's fragile trust to this man who felt more like a predator than a friend. I consulted my mother, who had been distant and quiet since Dad's diagnosis, and her silence spoke volumes. It was a low-grade anxiety that bubbled just under the surface, a synchronous heartbeat with my own buried fears. That night, I caved into the entangling dread and called the office, leaving a message, insisting that only I would accompany Dad to his appointment. The relief coursing through my veins was short-lived. When the day finally came, I met Walter standing at the front door, a smug smile plastered across his face, as if he had anticipated my next move. My father, clad in one of his favorite flannel shirts, looked caught between confusion and disappointment, but I latched onto his gaze, conveying a silent message that shattered my heart but bolstered my conviction. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I stepped forwards, "I think it's best if I come with you today." Walter scoffed, retorting too quickly, "Oh come on, it's just a checkup. You don't need to coddle him like this." Each syllable felt like barbed wire wrapped around the words, tugging at something primal and repulsive inside me. A scream clawed at the back of my throat, fought tooth and nail against the savagery consuming my rationality. "This isn't just a checkup," I shot back defensively. "It's one of the most significant days he'll have in months. You don't need to be there. You're not his family." My father blinked, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but Walter's reaction was sinister in nature. It turned from shock to thin-lipped anger, a quiet promise of retribution hidden beneath tightly wound lips. The tension crackled in the air like pre-storm electricity, and suddenly, I felt as if every single unwelcome thought I'd buried deep beneath the surface burrowed its way back into prominence, revealing the possibility that Walter could very well be a wolf in sheep's clothing, his concerns surprisingly coordinated with plans I couldn't even fathom. Fine, Walter said, a smile creeping back onto his face like a spider waiting for its chance to snag its prey, but you'll see, my support was what he needed after all. As my father slipped on his coat and I ushered him forward, I dared not glance back at Walter, but a cold chill washed over me, an irrational fear gnawing at my insides like rats feasting on the carcass of my worst nightmares. The ride to the hospital was a silent war zone. I searched for the right words to calm my racing heart. My dad nodded, oblivious to my internal struggle, as I feigned casual conversation about the upcoming baseball season, drowning every overture of worry beneath a thin ocean of pleasantries. When we finally arrived, the walls around us seemed to close in with every passing moment, and as we stepped into the sterile waiting room, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that Walter was lurking just beyond the proximity of that polished glass entrance. Hours passed slowly, dragging our spirits into the unforgiving jaws of uncertainty, each tick of the clock as menacing as the last. When my father was finally called in for his examination, I was asked to wait, and though I tried to maintain an air of nonchalance, my heart thudded painfully, each beat a reminder of everything I feared. And then, without warning, there he was, Walter, striding into the waiting area, face plastered with a sinister blend of smugness and feigned concern. "Good news, huh?" he chirped, as if the world shrank around us to conform to his twisted whims. "I'll be here for my dear friend no matter what." My stomach churned, wrestling the truth that clawed at me. "Walter, you shouldn't be here," I stammered, a fight tangled within me against the absurdity of the interview. "Why do you keep coming around?" The look that fell across Walter's face was something indescribably dark as he stepped closer. "Because someone has to ensure he receives the care he deserves. It would be a shame if something happened to him, by virtue of not having the right people around." The nuance painted in his words dripped with malevolence, the air locked in a state of compression as realization dawned on me. I leapt back, a chill overtaking my skin. "You've been sending anonymous messages, haven't you? You've been trying to manipulate him." My accusations hung in the air, feeble but resonating with the truth crashing against my consciousness. Without uttering a word, he leaned closer, and I felt the walls closing in. It was as if my head spun, revelations crashing like glass against stone, the fraying thread of trust unraveling before my very eyes. I fled from him, desperate to reach my father's side, my heart racing, echoing the silent screams spinning in my mind, but by the time I pushed past the nurses to enter the examination room, the words I'd rehearsed had turned to dust on my tongue. My father lay back, a weary smile plastered on his face, and I caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes as he met my gaze. My heart sank. He didn't see the monster lurking just beyond the hospital walls. Instead, it was me, a pariah in the realm of protectiveness. I rushed towards him, wanting nothing more than to mount a defense against the darkness crawling into our lives. "Dad, you need to." Just as I began to explain, Walter sauntered into the room, seamlessly sliding into the space like he owned it. "You can't live in fear anymore. You have me, I'm your friend and I'm here," he insisted, his tone deceptively calm yet devoid of sincerity. My father blinked, twitching uneasily beneath the pressure of conflicting loyalties, and it felt like hours between breaths. The doctor interrupted us, and relief coiled around my heart like a snake, only for dread to nearly engulf me whole when I left the room to glimpse Walter alone with my father, whispering sweet poison that danced dangerously on the edge of tainted truth. I wrestled with the idea that I needed to pull my father from Walter's grasp. His web was spun tighter than I fathomed. I caught a glimpse of their post-reaction through the frosted glass of the door, Walter's hand resting too nonchalantly atop my father's shoulder. My chest tightened, adrenaline flooding my system, my scream almost escaping my lips when the distant conversation morphed into a grotesque display of betrayal. I burst through the doorway, and as the words tumbled from my mouth, a cacophony of emotions spiraled around me. "Leave him alone," I yelled, every ounce of fear pouring into those words. Walter turned, eyes laced with surprise. "She's just upset because she knows we're getting closer," he chirped casually, yet the menace dripping from that statement sent goosebumps racing along my skin. My father's expression, perplexed and vulnerable, tugged at my core as he looked between Walter and me. In that instant, I understood the depth of Walter's deception, the slowly curling tendrils of malice wound around my father's already fragile spirit. "You don't need him, Dad. You have me. We'll do this together," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the weight of my realization crashing down on me in waves that threatened to encase us both. The doctor stepped in just then, canceling out the tension, and I caught Walter's eyes flicker to something behind me. I turned, electrified, a specter of dread. washed over me as I realized he had a plan, something sinister orchestrated within the walls of this sterile fortress. After the appointment concluded, I insisted on finding a new oncologist, my father's indifference echoing hollow against the rising tide of my anguish. It was then that I began hearing whisperings through the townsfolk and family friends, small hints painted over Walter's troubled past, a tapestry entwined with quiet malevolence and ghost stories that left me unsettled. Nightmares haunted my sleep, each encounter with Walter grew more distorted, wrapping itself around my psyche. I couldn't let him invade our lives any longer, but how could I convince my father of the truth? Eventually, my father grew weaker, the cancer took its toll, and all the while Walter gathered around like a vulture, determined to feed off the fragments of my family. One night, after a fraught dinner where Walter's charm barely masked his undertones, I knew I had to expose him, unveil the monster for who he truly was. I called my father to the living room. By now he was frail and pale, and I could see the shadows that tag-teamed with Walter's presence. It felt as though the very air shimmered with an unreadable tension. "Dad," I began slowly, "we need to talk about Walter. I want to share what I discovered." The moment I uttered his name, the familiar gleam of disapproval glimmered in my father's eyes, and I could see Walter's shadows stretching across the room like dark wings, encircling me in his grasp. "Don't listen to her, old friend," Walter interjected smoothly, "she's just scared of losing you. We all know she tends to exaggerate, don't we?" But my father shook his head, tired but urgent. I could feel his heart battling against the manipulation lurking behind Walter's facade. "You need to understand, he's not what you think he is. He's been lying to you about his intentions." The room stilled, and in that breathless silence, my mind raced. "He's been sending anonymous letters to make it seem like you're worse off than you are. He's trying to take control of the decisions and manipulate you," Walter chuckled, feigning a mockery of restraint. "Sweetheart, isn't it sad how desperately she clings to this idea to keep herself relevant?" But my father narrowed his eyes, a fleeting clarity washing over him. Yet in the wreckage of dissected truth, chaos erupted, and Walter's visage morphed into a furious beast as he lunged towards me, venom dripping from his smile. "You ungrateful little rat. After everything I've done for you, you dare defile my name?" The vulnerability I clung onto began crumbling, and my heart raced as I dove towards my father's side with a growl that reverberated through the walls of our home. This was a battle for survival, a last fight to ensure he wouldn't succumb to the poison oozing from Walter. "Dad, please, you need to believe me," I cried desperately, as Walter's towering presence threatened to engulf us both. I realized then that Walter's grip had taken a form we hadn't yet acknowledged, a resonance of death that fed upon our house like a cancer of its own, and with a flicker of realization, I could feel the shadows pulling at my father's breath, tightening beyond relief. I composed myself, lending everything my heart had against the suffocating wall of Walter, and declared, "If you love him, you'll let him go." Walter's laughter lingered, a cacophony that seemed to bounce off the walls before a sudden silence erupted, and I watched in horror as my father hesitated, a flicker of recognition lighting his eyes. The horror spiraled as I made the realization that his only allies were the ghosts of Walter's manipulation, wielding the tenacity of a predator ready to feast. But I refused to back down. I had so much more to say. I needed him to grasp the truth, and it screamed louder than Walter's veiled threats. A moment of poise fell, and when Walter clenched his jaw, I knew that I didn't just seek to save myself but to out anyone who stood even in the periphery of my father's existence. "You may think that you're infallible, but the weight of your lies will bury you." My heart felt like it was shattering, the final pleads vibrating within my own empathy as the walls held their breath, and somewhere deep inside, I felt shivers slither across the threshold. I waited, holding the air, straining for a crack in Walter's facade, searching for the slightest glimpse of vulnerability. "Enough," Walter roared, collapsing into a distorted semblance of rage, his mask peeling away. "You think you can just take him away? He's mine. I thought you had a stronger bond with him. This is how it has always been." With a growing intensity, the air thrummed, the rage pulsed within the room, and as Walter's frustration peaked, it felt like a storm encroaching upon us. If I could just hold on to my father, a newfound strength carving a connection between us, perhaps we could find redemption. The distance and estrangement cloaked the air, but fury ferreted out the truth hidden within. I stepped forward once more, offering my hand to my father, anchoring him against Walter's maelstrom. "Let's leave together," I said softly, my heart desperate against the agony of losing the pivotal relationship to a monster who had no right to claim him. At that moment, an eerie stillness descended, and I witnessed the shifting shadows around us, the fatigue that racked my father's frail body battling against the tendrils snaking from Walter's malevolent smile. "You can't save him from the truth," Walter whispered. "He will always be with me." "No more," I thought fiercely, feeling a tide of my voice igniting the calm spaces surrounding us. "No, we can build a future together." The ugly truth revealed as we stepped outside, leaving behind a fragment of itself while welcoming ourselves into the light of new beginnings, the future flickering before us, painstaking yet full of promise. But the last whispers of Walter's proposition wouldn't simply vanish, they lingered behind us like shadows demanding acknowledgement. Weeks passed, during which our home transformed, dwindling specters fading out and acceptance pulling us back into the warmth of family. The truth clocks in, pieces falling into place, as I began helping Dad in ways I feared to lose. But bursts of fear often struck at night. Even though Walter's grip had lessened, the remembrance of what bruised betrayal could do festered as an unease spinning in cycles. It wasn't until one dark, moonless night when nightmares draped themselves around my father and rushed towards the door, a frantic rap echoing against the rich silence. Reading the moment, I approached the door cautiously, the fury of nervous energy surging beneath my skin as the wood groaned beneath my grip. Who could it be? I hesitated, remembering all too clearly the edges that Walter put upon our existence. When I finally opened it, the chill in the air carried the sharp scent of fear. My father blinked, utterly confused, forged in the alleys of worry, and now burdened further by uncertainty. "It's him, isn't it?" I murmured, my heartbeat harmonizing with the echoes surrounding me. "He's coming back for us." The trepidation clouded his expression, and as doubt etched itself deep within my father's brow, I could feel the shadows once more. It felt like the beginning swirling beneath the surface, remnants of a battle unearthed. "You're not going back there," I breathed firmly, feeling the weight of resolution solidifying around us as the seconds dwindled into eternity. Yet Walter wasn't finished. I could feel those eyes probing our defenses, waiting to reclaim the fragments he sought, to wrap them once more within the binding tales of betrayal and tendrils with which he'd strangled our past. A decision rested firmly between us. I steeled my resolve against every ounce of anxiety, fitfully battling against the shadows that might lie ahead. I had freed us once, and I wouldn't surrender with the chains of fear tethered once more. As the door creaked behind me, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a stronger bond forged beneath harrowing trials and solidified through every grain of untold sacrifice. I had to convince my father that vulnerability was the foundation of our freedom, that the shadows could only do harm if we allowed them entry. Together, we would endure, for the truth of family burned brighter than the cold encroaching darkness, one which I refused to let win its relentless battle over us. And in that commitment, I felt the darkness encroach upon us, twist into unseen dimensions. Even if Walter tried re-entering our space, I would not let him reclaim the love that remained. I fought for every shred of hope, for every moment that manifested genuine bonds forged through solemnity, warmed by genuine love. It was in that resolve that we pushed back against the darkness, into the light of possibility, the kind that promised liberation from chains that could never be fastened against family, of a future beyond the haunting whispers of Walter's name, long faded yet wordlessly existing, intertwining real ties and those infernal shadows hovering just outside our reach. When my grandmother passed away last month, grief wrapped around me tighter than the layers of fabric in my well-worn dark gray coat, the only one I'd ever needed for funerals. It didn't matter that it was the same coat I'd worn to bury my father just a few years before. I remember standing beside my mother at the dining table, her eyes swollen, reflecting a bleak mix of sorrow and irritation as she insisted that I needed a new black coat for the funeral because, in her words, black is the color of mourning, and your father would never forgive you for showing up in dark gray. I didn't understand why a different coat mattered so much when the sorrow it cloaked was the same, but she couldn't fathom that my attachment to that gray coat went beyond aesthetics. Desperate for my own space amidst the chaos of grief, I refused her demands, feeling my heart thud heavily as family discussions dwindled to whispered criticisms directed at me, portraying me as the ungrateful son who couldn't muster the decency to honor his deceased relatives appropriately. The societal pressure to wear a fresh coat became unbearable, and as I walked through the house that echoed with muted memories of family gatherings and laughter, I felt as though the essence of my loved ones lingered in the folds of that same coat, every crease a moment shared, every thread a lesson learned. On the night before the funeral, my mother barricaded herself in her room, and I found myself outside, staring at the growing shadows of the trees in our yard, their gnarled branches twisting like the pain inside me. I was losing everything dear, quickly engulfed by an anxious fog that choked my breaths, and yet, there was a stubborn part of me that clung to that old coat like a life buoy amidst rising tides of despair. Just as I resolved to wear what I felt connected to, I saw the weathered figure of my grandmother, her spectral form flickering in the moonlight, clutching the rope in her hands, just out of my reach. She whispered secrets of the past in the rustle of the leaves, and I felt something shift in my core, a reconciliation with her essence urging me onward. When I finally slipped that coat on, its lingering scent comforting and reminiscent of days gone by, I felt her approval envelop me, more potent than any new black fabric could offer. I may have failed to meet the expectations of a mother mourning her mother, but as I walked into the funeral home the next day, my chest expanded fiercely, fusing the layers of loss into one coherent resolve. However, it wasn't the weight of the coat that caught the attention of others, it was the hushed conversations around me, the scathing glares that sliced through the room and branded me as the odd son. My heart raced as I held my breath for the eulogies, seeking solace in the heartfelt sentiments shared by relatives, but when the speech turned toward traditional attire, my heart sank. I looked around to see the disapproving glances, relatives who I'd only ever seen dressed in black now aimed to paint my grief as colors beyond the spectrum of acceptance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the disdain and disappointment whispered behind my back echoed louder than the sorrowful words being uttered. No. I wouldn't let that coat overshadow the memories embodied in my actions. I held the fabric tight, its significance well known only to me and my grandmother, who had poured her soul into sewing all the buttons that clasped their spirit through intertwining threads of our family's legacy. Halfway through the eulogy, I stepped outside to collect my thoughts, greeted by the crisp bite of late autumn air, which felt like a bitter reprimand, punctuating that pervasive loneliness which seemed to chase me even in the company of family. My resolve wavered as the temptation to conform roared in my chest. I shuffled my feet, heart pounding as whispers about me drifted through the thin walls, shrouding me in a tempest of guilt. Did I really deserve to hold on to my memories, my grief, while causing a rift in my family? Just as doubt flooded my being, a rustling sound came from behind me, an old woman in a shabby old coat, much like mine. She didn't appear lost in sorrow but radiant in the brilliance of her past. I noticed the subtle but defiant sparkle in her eyes. She leaned in and whispered, "Tell me, dear boy, does a coat determine love? Does the ink of fabric hold the grave weight of grief, its fabric woven in time?" A second passed, and I felt the urge to spill my heart to this stranger, her presence igniting a warmth that made the chill of discontent fall away. "Be true to your love, dear heart," she continued, "that is the only thread that carries you through the veil." By the time I returned inside, I had shed the chains of my mother's expectations, ready to face the judging gasps with conviction. I reclaimed that gray coat, stigmata of love laced with mourning. It had become a monument, and I, in my unyielding stance against convention, finally understood that it wasn't a question of right or wrong. It was a testament to the bonds shared with those we have buried in the earth, a visual legacy that would haunt the fabric of our lives forever. Yet, just when I believed my resolve would silence the whispers, something jolted me, something I couldn't explain. As I stood there, tears spilling down my cheeks, the air grew painfully thick. A chilling wail erupted from behind me, sending a shiver down my spine as the elderly lady's comforting presence began to dissolve into darkness, the echoes of her words transforming into a strange song filling the room. It was as if the shadows were hungry for the bonds we'd forged, ready to unravel every moment I had thought was sacred. My heart raced again, but this time, it was gripped in vice-like fear. What had I unleashed by clinging to my beloved gray coat? Suddenly, the cacophony of mourning morphed into laughter. Family members were grinning grotesquely, their faces stretching uncomfortably, eyes gleaming with desperation as if they desired to wrestle my coat from me, as if the very fabric prevented them from accessing the shared mourning we all needed to bury. As they moved toward me, engulfing my space with taunts of betrayal, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had focused on me. The burden I carried had morphed into a sort of interloper that would not allow my family the catharsis they so demanded. I was slipping into a darkness that resonated deeply from the fabric, as though the memories that should have kept me rooted were becoming malicious, dragging me into depths of despair where coats had never mattered, but souls did. They were reaching for the coat, their laughter edging into madness, and I realized the family beneath the funeral garb had become ravenous specters, controlled by their hidden grief and impossible expectations. In that moment, grief twisted sinister, submerged in a deep well that churned beneath the fabric I clung to like a lifeline, and all I could do was turn and run, abandoning the whispers, the coiling darkness that craved to drag me into their ocean of shared torment, while my heart echoed with the ghosts of memory that tangled with the whispers of goodbye. Just when I thought I'd escaped the nightmare, I fell through the door, tumbling out into the cold world, only to see the reflection of that old woman, standing on the brink of the graveyard, beckoning me back as shadows flickered around my shivering frame. I screamed, not caring who heard me, trapped between guilt and love, whispers of family now reinforcing the doom that followed on the wind. Ida. I thought to myself, clutching at the dark gray coat that reflected my soul's turmoil, feeling time unfurl as the threads of my life became wisps of mourning, as fragile and relentless as the hatred swelling within. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where I'd have to confront my boyfriend's aunt over a Coachella ticket, but here I am, sitting on this dingy couch, heart racing as the realization of what just transpired washes over me like a tidal wave. It all started innocently enough. My boyfriend, Jake, had promised me a magical weekend filled with music, friends, and memories after saving up for months to attend the festival, and when I casually mentioned that I'd be bringing my best friend Sarah along too, Jake's excitement turned into something else entirely. He had a pretty big family, and while I loved spending time with them, his Aunt Linda was a piece of work, horribly intrusive and always looking for ways to reap the benefits of being part of the family. So when she sidled up to me at dinner last week, flashing her overly bright smile and the glimmer of something sinister in her eyes, I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Oh, sweetie, how nice for you to go to Coachella. I'd love to see what all the fuss is about," she cooed, her voice dripped with mock sincerity. I didn't think much of it at first, but that Saturday morning when I reached for my ticket to send to Sarah, my stomach dropped, it was gone. I frantically searched every corner of my room, thinking I'd simply misplaced it, but deep down, I knew. I could feel her eyes watching me during dinner, lingering a little longer when she asked, and I gleefully explained how I'd managed to snag a ticket against the odds. It felt awful admitting it to Jake, but he was just as angry as I was. He assured me we'd confront her together. So, the following Sunday, after pacing back and forth, rehearsing a dozen ways to address the theft, we finally knocked on her door. I mean, I never wanted to escalate the situation, but when she opened the door in her threadbare pajamas, looking more disheveled than usual, and when I said, "Aunt Linda, we need to talk about the ticket," her expression shifted from surprise to amusement, and then to smugness, like she held all the cards in this game that I barely understood. "Oh sweetheart, did you really think you'd get away with that? A Coachella ticket? You should have known I'd take it. It's nothing personal, it's just business," she said matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing the weather. An icy pit formed in my stomach as the earlier thrill of my impending trip dissipated into sheer disbelief. "You can't be serious. You're stealing from your own family." "That's messed up," I managed to choke out, but she waved her hand dismissively, her laughter echoing in that cramped entryway. That's when I snapped, "I could call the cops on you, Linda. Stealing a ticket is still a crime," I spat, regretting my harsh tone a moment later, but the truth hung in the air, and I could tell it hit her harder than I expected. The lightheartedness faded as something darker tightened around her eyes, and for a brief moment, it felt as if shadows shifted within her soul, revealing fractured intentions. "You really want to take this higher?" she asked, amusement gone, replaced by a low, chill-inducing whisper. My palms became clammy. I hadn't actually wanted to threaten her or anything, but there was something twisted about the way she responded, like she was unbothered and yet simmering beneath the surface. Without waiting for my reply, she slammed the door shut, leaving Jake and me standing there in utter disbelief. The drive home was numbingly silent, but the tension hung between us like a potential storm on the horizon. A week passed and our Coachella dreams began to fade into bitter memories, and that's when I received a text, "I hope you're ready for me to spoil your weekend." I felt a wave of anger mixed with dread as I read the message again. Who the hell did she think she was? Jake urged me to let it go, saying it wasn't worth the trouble, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Aunt Linda was more than just a quirky family member with questionable morals. The night before we were set to leave, I couldn't sleep. The thought of stepping into a festival atmosphere while knowing she might be lurking around transformed my excitement into anxiety. I smashed my phone down when another notification lit up, followed by a loud, menacing snicker cascading from the darkness outside my window. A memory flickered to life, the way that Linda gazed at me, almost as if she enjoyed my discomfort. That very night, Sarah, who had driven in from out of town, texted that she was running late due to roadwork, and in no time, Jake and I were ready to go, practically bouncing off the walls despite the aura of dread contradicting our enthusiasm. The sun beat down mercilessly as we drove to the venue, the vibe electric with anticipation, yet I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Glancing around, jitters coursed through me until we finally parked and made our way through the crowd, the bass vibrating beneath our feet, the air thick with the sweet aroma of festival food and excitement. Music filled the air as we found our place among friends, but as the first band took the stage, I felt someone watching me from the edge of the crowd. My heart raced as I turned. There, mingling with festival goers, was Aunt Linda, looking as innocent as ever, rocking her signature flower crown. Panic clouded my mind. Did she come to ruin my experience, or was it some twisted intervention? I nudged Jake and pointed. What the hell is she doing here? He turned sharply. Give it a rest, she's probably just enjoying herself, but I wasn't convinced. I spent the next few sets watching her from afar, and the longer I stared, the more she appeared to embody this harbinger of chaos, weaving through groups of people and then disappearing into the crowd. It was only during the third set that everything escalated. Sarah and I were dancing, lost in the rhythms, but suddenly I felt a hand grab my shoulder, yanking me back. I spun around, ready for a confrontation, when I came face to face with Linda, her eyes glinting with something dark, her mouth twisted in a strange smile. You didn't think you'd get here unscathed, did you? She sneered, her voice a sickly sweet whisper. My stomach dropped as Jake rushed to my side, anger flaring in his chest, but before he could say anything, she leaned in closer, her breath cold against my ear and said, You should have kept your mouth shut, honey, you have no idea who you're dealing with. This is my playground. Then she slipped into the crowd, leaving us stunned, my heart racing in my chest. I felt sick. Who was this woman that she turned a simple estrangement into something so sinister? I wanted to enjoy this festival more than anything, but the gnawing sense of danger lingered like a shadow, overshadowing even the brightest moments. The night stretched on, and hours passed, filled with intoxicating music and laughter tinged with anxiety until finally, just when I thought I could breathe easy again, I turned and spotted Linda once more, lurking, but this time she was speaking to a group of security guards. Fear coursed through me. There was no doubt in my mind this woman was plotting something malicious. Within moments, murmurs began spreading through the crowd, and then chaos erupted. Someone had punched one of the security guards, and as bodies began to flee, I saw Jake look toward me, panic etched across his face. We have to go now, he yelled, and we made a run for it along with hundreds of others, the bliss of the festival engulfed by sheer terror. I glanced back and saw Linda, somehow reveling in the pandemonium she'd unleashed, and it hit me, the ticket, the threat, the laughter, they'd all been part of some twisted game she played, and now I was a player in her insane reality. As we slipped past the barriers and swarmed into the parking lot, the echoes of sirens neared with each step. Where did she go? I gasped, searching the crowd, but my entire body screamed that this wasn't over. We piled into the car, and although Jake fumbled with keys, I stared into the chaos we'd just escaped. Aunt Linda's insane, I breathed. He nodded, eyes fixed on the growing crowd around us. Just when we thought we'd slipped away, my phone buzzed again with a text, You can't escape me. I'll find you, sweetheart. That night, every ounce of excitement was completely drained from me, and as we sat parked outside our apartment, I realized this Coachella trip had turned into a nightmare filled with threats woven into memories, and Aunt Linda was only the beginning. I never thought I'd say this, but I might actually have to call the cops. I wasn't planning on going to my family's Thanksgiving dinner this year. I had been avoiding my relatives since that summer when my cousin Jake had found the old family recipe book in my grandmother's attic, the one marked with an odd symbol on the cover, like a twisted vine, which he insisted we use for the pumpkin pie, but I shrugged him off, dismissing any thoughts of using something that felt so out of place in a holiday tradition. Still, after weeks of nagging from my mother, I reluctantly agreed to attend, convinced that it would simply be a classic fight over politics and the same old complaints about how I was still single in my mid-20s. Yet, as the last rays of autumn sunlight dipped below the horizon and I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, a strange feeling twisted in my stomach, an instinct warning me that something was lurking just beneath the surface of this seemingly normal family gathering. I walked into the house, smelling the familiar aromas of roast turkey and stuffing, which should have felt comforting but instead only heightened my unease, every chuckle shared over the table echoing like an uninvited specter mocking me. When dessert was announced, I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back as Jake was called upon to serve the pumpkin pie he had so wickedly insisted on preparing. I watched him slice it, the knife sliding through it like it was soft butter, revealing an unusual number of seeds embedded within, but no one else seemed bothered by it as they dove eagerly into their helpings, laughter fading to a low murmur as I glanced around the table, noticing Jake getting more animated as he spoke about this special pie, whispering how the recipe had been passed down for generations, but the glee in his voice had an unsettling edge I couldn't quite place. I felt compelled to try it, despite the gnawing voice in my head screaming for me to stop, so I reluctantly took a slice, the flavor exploding in my mouth, sweet yet somehow earthy, its richness unsettling yet addictive. As I swallowed, a dangerous lump formed in my throat, a panic rising when I caught Jake watching me, a smirk crossing his lips that sent icy tendrils snaking down my spine. The room felt claustrophobic, laughter morphing into distant chatter as I tried to maintain a smile, feeling the heaviness of the pie settle in my stomach like an anchor, each passing moment dragging me deeper into a pit of dread until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood abruptly, the sound of my chair scraping against the wooden floor tearing through the haze of conversation, and declared I was leaving, my heart racing as Jake's smile seemed to widen impossibly, genuine concern now masking a flicker of something darker. As I hurried out, I could hear my family's confused voices behind me, but all I could think was that I needed to get away from the house, the laughter that once filled it now sounding like derisive whispers in my ears. Storming out into the cool air, I felt both dizzy and wired, plunging into my car and slamming the door, my eyes darting back at the house lit up like a misplaced island of warmth in the dark, a beacon that now felt utterly sinister. It was only when I pulled out of the driveway that I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw Jake standing on the porch with a wide, sickening grin, the odd symbol from the recipe book now burned into my memory, and with every passing moment, the twisted reality began to settle in. What had he really put in that pie? I drove for what felt like hours, heart racing and mind racing faster, the thought of venturing back home making my stomach churn anew, but something inside told me to drive somewhere safe, somewhere normal. After pulling into the nearest gas station, I stumbled inside, seeking solace in the flickering fluorescent lights, but as I approached the cashier, my heart sank when I saw the subtle, knowing smirk on the cashier's face, his fingers idly tapping rhythmically on the counter almost like a signal, and everything that had felt odd lately crashed down on me, the feeling of familiarity, of dread, consuming me whole the second that cashier leaned forward and whispered, low and conspiratorial, "You shouldn't have left, the seed will find its way back to you." I bolted from the station, frantically spitting the words, "What did you mean?" into the window, but only the howling wind answered back, beckoning me home as the road stretched before me like a sinister path. When I finally returned home, the house loomed larger than before, shadows creeping across the porch like fingers grasping for the night. My family's laughter echoed again, but this time it felt warped, a cacophony of invasive whispers, relentlessly urging me to step inside. I pushed through the door and stepped into the dining room, where the remnants of our abandoned dinner remained. The pumpkin pie sat at the center, untouched and glistening in the dying light, looking more like a trophy than a dessert, and my family greeted me with smiles that felt jagged and twisted, eyes glinting as if they were anticipating something I was all too terrified to comprehend. There, at the head of the table, Jake's expression was almost a riddle, a puzzle formed of sinister delight, when he beckoned me forward, commanding me to take a seat, but every instinct within me screamed to run away. I could feel tendrils of darkness wrapping around my limbs, slowly pulling me down into the chair like glue, insistent, as the pie appeared to glare at me, glare with seated familiarity that echoed the night of shadows that still loomed over the house. The last thing I saw before everything spiraled into an unending void was Jake lifting the knife, that same wicked grin plastered across his face as he prepared to serve another slice, my scream of an unrecognizable foreboding cutting through the atmosphere, but dread pooled in my stomach as I knew, at that moment, the seed had begun to grow. I always thought of my sister as my best friend, but everything changed when she married Mark. He was charming at first, but something about him gave me the creeps, like he was always watching, calculating. When they moved into the same town, I was excited to be closer to her, but the more I interacted with Mark, the more I sensed his controlling nature lurking beneath the surface. I'd find myself cringing at the way he spoke to her, each word coated in a smug arrogance that seemed to grow brazen as time went on. He'd often interrupt her, making her laugh off his jabs like they were just bad jokes while I could see the hurt flash across her face. I tried to talk to her about it once, but she brushed it off, insisting he was just being protective, and I could feel an icy wall build between us as she defended him. But there was something inside me that refused to back down. It felt wrong, like watching a slow train wreck you were powerless to stop. Then one afternoon, as I walked by a florist, an idea sprouted in my mind, dark, mischievous, and maybe a little vindictive. I decided to send her flowers anonymously, nothing too extravagant, just a simple bouquet with a note that read, "You deserve better." At first, I thought it would lift her spirits, a small reminder that she was loved outside of her marriage, but when I saw the hurt in her eyes during dinner as she showed them to Mark, everything took a horrifying twist. He exploded, throwing around accusations that I was trying to seduce her, that I'd always been jealous of their relationship, and my heart sank as I realized the depth of his paranoia. To keep the peace, she apologized, but I swore I saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze, a silent acknowledgement that maybe I was right. The next week, I sent another bouquet, more elaborate this time, with a note that said, "You're worth so much more than this." Her laughter was hollow when she showed them to Mark, who turned scarlet, eyes blazing. He snapped at her, demanding to know who was sending the flowers, and this time, I could see the chains tightening around her. The fragile smile she offered cracked under the weight of his fury, and I felt sick to my stomach knowing I was the catalyst for his wrath. I thought she'd open up to me, confide in me about how she felt trapped, but instead, she retreated into herself, and for weeks, I would hear her forced laughter from the other room, as if she were trying to convince herself everything was fine. I hesitated to send another bouquet, but my urge to protect her consumed me. It screamed that I had to keep hope alive somehow. So, I decided to send a single red rose with the note, "Remember who you are." When she found it, Mark threw a fit so intense I could hear him all the way from my apartment, the walls shaking with his forced masculinity. I worried he'd become abusive, prayed he wouldn't cross that line, but every time I saw her, I sensed more cracks appearing in her facade. I could tell she was unhappy now. The strained look on her face told me everything I needed to know, but still, she didn't say a word to me. Days turned to weeks, and with every flower, I felt the line between caring older brother and meddling lunatic blurring. One night, I received an unmarked envelope on my doorstep, and when I opened it, my heart stopped. It was a photograph of me taken from an angle that could only have been taken from the window of my apartment, followed by an ominous note saying, "Stop." Fear gripped me, tightening like a vice. I knew it was Mark, threatening me that I was crossing some line, but a part of me didn't care. I contemplated reaching out to my sister, but I knew it would only unleash hell. I was trapped in this spiral, unable to save her without destroying our relationship entirely. As I lay awake at night, the resolution to protect her only grew. Mark was a disease, and I was an antibiotic trying to fight it, so I decided to make one last move. I hired a private investigator to gather evidence, to follow Mark and see who he really was, hoping I could save her from whatever hell he had dragged her into. The investigator uncovered chilling truths. Mark had a record of harassment with previous girlfriends, and he'd been reported multiple times for suspicious behavior. Armed with evidence, I finally confronted my sister, pouring out everything I had learned in a desperate attempt to reach her. But instead of relief, something in her demeanor changed. Her eyes hardened as she turned away, and my heart sank. She called Mark immediately, and when he arrived, the storm that followed was catastrophic. He accused me of stalking him, of invading our lives, and I was filled with such dread when she didn't defend me that I knew I had lost her. My heart twisted as I realized the depths of her loyalty to him, a loyalty he had fostered through manipulation and fear. That night, I sat in fog-filled despair, staring at the walls of my lonely apartment, my phone buzzing with messages from my sister saying she never wanted to talk to me again, that I had ruined her life. My gut twisted. The only sound in the room was my shaky breaths as I mourned the loss of her light in my life. But then, just as I thought things couldn't get worse, the investigator called me with urgent news. Mark had a plan to leave the state with my sister. Panic coursed through my veins like ice as I rushed to her apartment, ready to beg her to stay, to fight for her. But when I arrived, I found the door ajar, the shadows inside stretching like nightmares, and the heavy quiet beckoning me to step into what felt like doom. I called out her name, dread flooding my senses, and when I stepped inside, the chilling sight I found left my heart in shards. The living room was a mess, overturned furniture, shattered glass, and in the center of it all, my sister, the fear painted across her face, standing before Mark who was seething with rage. I didn't recognize the man I once thought charming. He was a monster now, and before I could think, my protective instincts kicked in. I lunged forward, and what followed was a blur. Mark shouted something about betrayal, and as I fell, the two of us clashed in a tangle of limbs and fury. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a line, but my concern morphed into desperation as I tried to shield her from his rage. Then, in an instant, it shifted. I suddenly saw the fear in her eyes, but not for Mark. She was afraid of me. The realization hit hard as I stumbled back, horror-stricken to see her stance alongside him. "You have to leave. You're only making everything worse," she screamed, and the betrayal pierced through me like a knife. As the weight of her words sank in, I felt the ground fall beneath me, devastation swirling in my chest like a vast ocean of despair. The door slammed shut behind me as the frantic isolation pressed in around me. I grasped the fire escape's railing, doubled over in disbelief, then sat numbly against the cool metal, feeling the world morph into a blurred haze. That's when I realized it. I had become the monster. All my actions, my desperate attempts to save her had only led to more suffering. In trying to rescue her from a controlling husband, I had become someone who cornered her into a space of fear. And as I sat there overcome with emptiness, the shadows around me grew more oppressive. I could almost hear Mark's smug laughter echoing in the stillness, and for a fleeting moment, a chilling thought took root. Maybe those flowers had turned into something dark. Were they ever truly about helping her, or had I just harmed the only person I loved? At that moment, I realized I would never be able to sleep soundly again. Last summer, my friend Brian dared me to jump on his new trampoline after school, but I just shrugged it off, claiming I wasn't in the mood. Honestly, I felt a strange unease whenever I went near it, as if it were more of a portal than a simple backyard attraction. Brian was relentless, teasing me about being scared and insisting that it was perfectly safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You see, he had gotten that trampoline the previous weekend, almost impulsively, after attending a yard sale that offered it for a steal because the family was moving away quickly. As I tried to walk away from his persistent offers, I overheard Brian mention something about how the trampoline seemed alive to his little brother, Timmy, who was only 5 and had already developed this eerie attachment to it. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the remark, but later that night, I heard Timmy's laughter drifting into my window, and the sound was oddly distorted, a kind of echoing giggle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I told Brian about it the next day, he downplayed it, saying Timmy was just being a kid. Still, I couldn't help but remember the murmurings I had heard from the other kids at school, whispers about the last owners of that trampoline, the couple who vanished without a trace, leaving their house in disarray and their yard littered with the remnants of a normal family life. As days turned into weeks, and each day brought an increasing intensity of Timmy's obsession with the trampoline, I became more uneasy. I could often see him out there, springing into the air, laughing uncontrollably as if the trampoline was buoying him to new heights of joy. But every now and then, he would stop mid-jump, tilting his head as if listening to something from the shadows of their large oak tree. Finally, one late afternoon, I relented and agreed to join Brian and Timmy. As I climbed onto the trampoline, the surface felt unnaturally warm under my feet, almost pulsing, like it had a heartbeat. I tried to force a smile, bouncing gently, but that sensation of unease returned tenfold. It wasn't fear of falling, it was an instinctive dread that clawed at my stomach, warning me to get out before it was too late. Within minutes, Timmy returned to jumping, his laughter now edging towards something sinister. He would occasionally stop, staring wide-eyed at the ground, and that's when it hit me. I couldn't quite tell if he was laughing or if he was being called to something I couldn't see, a siren song that made him float just a little too close to the edge of sanity. That night, I lay in my bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that the trampoline had changed something in Timmy. It wasn't just a plaything anymore. I can't explain it rationally, but I started having dreams, vivid and grotesque, dreams of wide-open spaces and crooked shadows, of children jumping in circles, their laughter resonating into an empty abyss. I woke in a cold sweat, and when I glanced out the window, there was Timmy again, bouncing on the trampoline beneath the pallid light of the moon. But this time, it was just him, alone, with that faint aura of something in the air, a palpable tension simmering beneath the surface. By the end of that week, Timmy's parents pulled him away from the trampoline, claiming it was time for bed. But I knew better. I could see how the glow of the moonlight dimmed to a dull hue, the energy changing palpably as their home became quieter. The very next morning, though, I was jolted awake by the sound of frantic knocks on my door. It was Brian, panting and wide-eyed. He said Timmy had vanished from his room, and the last time anyone saw him, he had been headed toward the trampoline. My heart raced as we sprinted down the street, the sun glaring down unforgivingly, making our urgency feel desperate. As we neared the house, I could sense an oppressive aura surrounding that backyard, as if the air itself was warning me. We found Timmy standing still on the trampoline, fully awake, staring deeply into the air above him. Brian called out to him, but there was no response. He didn't even blink. I felt paralyzed. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced with a heavy silence that froze the bone. I grabbed Brian and pulled him back as I gasped for breath. I suddenly realized that Timmy looked older, his little face somehow transformed by the week's events. Then, just like that, he jumped. And kept going. Higher and higher, defying all laws of gravity, until he reached an impossible altitude, hovering suspended in midair with a glint of wild joy in his eyes, a dark and glittering promise that horrified me. "Timmy, get down," Brian shouted in desperation as I felt my stomach drop. Something was terribly wrong. Timmy turned and held out a tiny hand, as if inviting us to join him in that eerie state of bliss, but it was too late. Before we could comprehend what was happening, he was swallowed by a cloud of shadows that erupted from the edges of the trampoline, swallowing the sunlight and everything with it, leaving us standing breathless on a hollow lot, gasping at the absence of laughter where there once was pure childhood joy. I was left haunted by the thought that I had refused to jump that day, that despite my instincts screaming at me to stay away from that thing, I did nothing to protect Timmy. I watched as Brian collapsed to his knees, screaming for his brother in desperation, while I stood rooted on the ground, knowing the truth that I could never share, that sometimes, the thrill of the jump is a gateway to something darker, something that doesn't want to be found. Weeks passed, but the trampoline remained there, a grim reminder of our stupidity, our refusal to listen to instinct rather than the shrieking laughter of a child that felt all too inviting. To this day, I wonder if giving in would have turned the tides, if perhaps Timmy and I could have escaped those sinister depths together, but now, all I hear is the echo of his laughter from the lifeless backyard, making me question, was I truly the idiot for not jumping on that trampoline? My heart pounded in my chest like a drum as I stood at the edge of our yard, peering through the trees at the gathering across the street where my younger sister and her friends threw what they called a party. It wasn't the kind of party filled with balloons and cake, it was dark and chaotic, the flickering glow of a cheap disco light battling against the encroaching shadows of twilight. I had always been the responsible one, the one who stayed inside and studied while my sister, Mia, had been allowed to explore the edges of that reckless freedom. But as I listened to their laughter thick with smoke and heard the muffled beats of music that felt too loud for our suburban neighborhood, a knot of dread twisted in my stomach. When I accidentally overheard snippets of their conversations just a few nights before, a part of me wanted to look away, pretend I didn't hear them boast about sneaking out, drinking, and trying drugs, things I never thought Mia would dare to touch. But every time I thought about ignoring it, I pictured the way our mother would break if something happened to Mia, and the moral weight that pressed down on me was suffocating. I had to make a choice. So, I did what I thought was right, and I slipped through the door, my palms clammy against the cold brass knob, and I told our mother everything. At first, she didn't believe me, perhaps she couldn't bear to think that our sweet Mia, her golden child, could stoop to such depths. I led her to the window, hoping this time she would listen, and with each step toward that gathering, I felt the ground beneath me shift, the air growing heavy with anticipation for both of us. The moment she turned pale and I saw her fist clench, I knew I'd made the right choice. But the reality we stepped into was nothing short of catastrophic. Mia's laughter vanished into the night as Mom stormed over to where they were dancing, and I wished I could feel as invincible as they seemed. When Mom confronted her friends, I watched the chaos unfold, their innocence bled away, replaced by guilt, as they scattered like skittles dropped on asphalt. Mia, shattered and furious, faced our mother the way a wild animal afraid for its life might confront a hunter. What followed was a symphony of screaming that rattled the very windows, a confrontation that carved itself into the fabric of our family. My sister was kicked out of the house that night, a decision permeated with shame playing across my mother's face like a veil. The last time I saw Mia, she stood at the door, eyes locked onto mine, and I dared not look away. Could I, the one who had always protected her, really be the monster who caused all this? Was I, in fact, an awful person for looking out for her? Guilt ate at me for days following the incident, but there was also a creeping sense of fear lingering in the corners of my mind. As the days melted into weeks, Mia's absence turned our home into a hollow shell. Our mother's grief manifested in silence, each meal a reminder of the laughter that once filled the air. I received mixed messages from everyone. Friends at school whispered their pity while my teachers offered me haunting looks that spoke volumes, as if they miraculously knew my hand in the fray. I thought about reaching out to Mia, but the shame rooted me in place, tightening every nerve and leaving me wondering if I had made a dreadful mistake. One night, when I couldn't bear the haunting guilt any longer, I decided to text Mia, an olive branch, a feeble apology hidden behind layers of regret. But instead of the expected "I miss you" or "I understand," she simply replied, "You have no idea what you've done." Those words slashed through my chest. I half expected a sob fest but instead got cold dread that coiled within me. For weeks, I left my phone on my bed, too frightened to reach out again, until one day when I received an unexpected voicemail. "You'll pay for this," she snarled, her voice dripping with malice, warped and unrecognizable. From that moment on, the atmosphere shifted. I felt eyes on me, shadows lurking just behind my shoulders. I could hear the whisper of Mia's name on the wind whenever I walked to school, could sense the malicious energy in the air that followed me home. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, heart racing, convinced Mia had turned into something more sinister, a specter lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for the right moment to pounce. Then, the knocks started, quiet at first but building into furious strikes that made me jump. Each time I opened the door, my heart would leap, praying it was merely a neighbor or the pizza delivery guy, but always hoping to see her face, until one evening, it was my mother who answered the door, forcing a grin, sagging under the weight of her grief. That night, the silence deepened, a heavy blanket pressing over our home, and I could swear I heard Mia's laughter echoing off the walls in the dead of night. The weeks dragged on, my anxiety spiraled, until I could no longer tell when I was awake or dreaming. Then came the night of terror, an unspeakable thing that broke through the stillness of our home. It awakened me from a restless sleep, a piercing shriek echoing like steel scraping against stone. I bolted up, breath hitched in my throat, heart pounding as I grabbed my phone, praying it wasn't Mia, that she hadn't returned to exact her revenge. I opened the door a crack, shadows danced under the moonlight, and creeping dread slid into my bones. As I stepped into the hallway, the familiar scent of smoke clawed at my throat, reminding me of those forgotten nights by the tree across the street. What I found at the end was nothing I could have ever imagined. Mia stood there, features twisted in rage, surrounded by her friends, an odd gathering that felt both foreign and familiar in a way I couldn't comprehend. Except now, they wore masks, faces twisted in grotesque expressions, and when they turned to me, the air filled with chilling laughter that echoed my wildest fears, inhuman, mocking. "You should have left us alone," Mia hissed, her voice slipping through the masks of her friends, haunting and venomous. I tried to back away, but a force pulled me forward, chaotic energy bubbling in the air, vibrating through my bones, my heart racing in fear. "What do you want?" I stammered, but the swirling laughter grew louder, drowning out my voice and whispering, "It's your fault, you wanted this." In that moment, I realized the truth planted firmly in the pit of my stomach. I didn't just lose my sister that night, I had lost myself as well. The love I thought could conquer all had twisted into something malevolent, and I was left in a game I never volunteered to play. As the laughter soared, crescendoing into a feral din that shattered the walls of my sanity, frantic thoughts raced through my mind. Were they all just figments of my imagination? But the unmistakable truth clamped around my throat like a vice. I had brought this darkness upon both our lives. I could hear them chanting, words that stole the warmth from my soul, and at that moment, I understood their true nature. They were no longer just me as friends, they were something darker, something that thrived in the shadows I had feared all along. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of regret and despair suffocating, and there, in the dim light of the hallway, I realized not just who Mia had become, but also who I had become, a puppet on strings of guilt. As the laughter enveloped me, each teasing taunt whispered back memories of warmth, love, and laughter, replaced now by darkness, echoing indefinitely against the walls of our broken home. In that moment of clarity, I knew it was too late to save her, and too late to save myself. AITA for requesting an explanation for my money being spent without my consent? It started with a casual text from my sister, Emma, asking about some weird charges on my bank statement. At first, I thought she was just being paranoid, but that changed when I saw the numbers myself. I had already been on edge ever since I started to notice odd things around my apartment, items misplaced, food disappearing from my fridge, and the eerie sensation that someone was watching me. At first, I brushed it off as stress from my recently taxing job, but as the charges piled up and Emma discovered 4 mysterious withdrawals totaling over $1,000, I began to quake with a fear that flared deep within me. When I confronted Emma, she appeared genuinely concerned, urging me to monitor my accounts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something foul was lurking underneath. It wasn't just my money at stake but possibly my very security. One night, frayed with the tension, I decided to take action and installed a couple of security cameras around my apartment, small, inconspicuous, and just enough to give me peace of mind. Days passed, and everything seemed normal, until one evening I reviewed the footage and what I saw made my stomach drop: an unknown figure slipping through my back door, their movements too fluid, too practiced. It was a mess of jerky limbs, a shadow that crept between comfort and chaos. My heart raced as I flipped through the clips, finding evidence of this intrusion every night, a routine that felt like a sinister ballet played out on my own floor. I found myself losing sleep over the thought of this uninvited guest, replaying the footage over and over until I began to recognize patterns. He'd always visit around 2 a.m., rifling through my belongings, sometimes even holding my credit card, his face obscured by a cheap mask, but his hands, oh God, those hands, were skeletal, fingers darting like spiders, and it chilled my blood to watch him swipe my card for groceries, for God knows what with my hard-earned cash. I decided I had to do something drastic. Gathering my courage, I called a private investigator who specialized in cases of stalking and theft. After explaining my situation, he seemed just as perplexed, yet assured me he'd find the truth. He assured me I was not alone in this battle, and with my permission, he installed discreet cameras and started monitoring the situation. The next evening, I was jolted from sleep by a loud creak, the unmistakable sound of my back door swinging open. Heart pounding, I turned on the monitor to see the masked figure once more, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another figure, a woman in a flowing white dress, her long hair cascading in waves that concealed her face. They were conversing, low murmurs spilling into the silent night, and for a moment, I could have sworn one of them gestured towards my camera. Was this all just a sick prank? Suddenly, the two turned, and I could see the woman reach out, trailing her fingers over the edge of a knife she pulled from her waistband before wrapping her hand around the figure's wrist. Something deep in my gut warned me that they were no ordinary thieves. This was a premeditated act, some grotesque performance playing out in my living room. I felt paralyzed, half wishing to flee while simultaneously entranced by the surreal nature of it all. Just then, the woman looked directly into the camera and I swear she smiled, a wide, toothy grin that shattered my nerves into a million pieces. The following days descended into pure madness. I began receiving letters slipped under my door, the kind of letters that feel like a taunt from an unseen adversary. They spoke in riddles and whispered of my past, old secrets I thought I had buried alive, tales of debts I never acknowledged, family issues long resolved, and a chilling prophecy about how my curiosity would be my undoing. Night after night, I received strange deliveries, packages filled with personal items from my childhood, acquired during those hellish break-ins but intended for some twisted purpose only they understood. Then everything came crashing down on an ordinary Thursday evening when I received a chilling text from Emma. "I think they know about us," it read, accompanied by a picture of her home, the same woman from my video standing just outside her window, a finger pressed to her lips, as if to silence her. Panic surged through my body, and I dialed her number, begging to know if she was okay, but when she answered, her voice carried a tremor. "They came to my house, Jamie, asking about you. They said you were supposed to pay the price." Tears streamed down my face, clutching at my phone as she continued, "They told me to tell you to stop investigating or else." The call ended abruptly. I stood in my kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, dread choking me. After that, my world spiraled rapidly into an abyss of paranoia. Every sound morphed into a threat, shadows danced menacingly at the corners of my vision, and the silence was punctuated by an awareness I wished I could escape. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't breathe, trapped in an existential maze of horror. One fateful night, I mustered the courage to confront the twisted reality of my life. I figured if they wanted me, I'd meet them on my terms. I set up a final trap, luring them in with the results of my mounting searches, fake articles about how to win the lottery and the secret to eternal youth. I awoke just past midnight to the unmistakable sound of shuffling by my window. I could barely breathe as I crawled toward the security camera, heart racing, praying one final act would unveil the truth behind all of this. They slipped inside, the woman's laugh cutting through the insistent quiet as she plucked treasures from my drawers, memories, trinkets, possessions that were once dear to me. And then she turned, the mask slipping off her head to expose a face I knew all too well, my own twisted grin reflected in a funhouse mirror, stripped of its humanity. And there, standing beside her, was the very figure I had panicked over, his presence dark and foreboding. I realized, in that heart-stopping moment, that they were me, manifestations of every sin I'd ever committed rising to envelop me, whispering sweet promises of freedom if only I would embrace the chaos. At that moment, my fate lay in their hands, their hollow words chilling me to the bone as they reminded me, "You always wanted to know. I've been living with my foster parents for almost 3 years now, and when they first took me in, I felt a flicker of hope after the chaos of my biological family, but that hope quickly fizzled out like a cheap candle. They were nice at first, taking me to parks and letting me choose my favorite meals, but little by little, they began imposing rules that felt suffocating, especially when they decided that they had the right to put parental controls on my iPhone, the one my biological parents gave me before everything went south. That phone was a lifeline. It held pictures of my real mother laughing with me at the beach, messages from my father that said he'd always love me no matter what, and even a few voicemails I kept because they felt like echoes of a past life I couldn't fully remember. When my foster parents broached the subject of parental controls, suggesting it was for my safety, maybe even to protect me from myself after they caught me watching some videos that spiraled into dark territory, I was furious. It felt as if they were digging a grave for my memories, trying to erase everything I had left of my real family. My fists clenched as I remember their voices, calm, yet deceptively firm, telling me it was for my own good. I felt small and powerless as they explained how the internet was a dangerous place, filled with shadows lurking behind every click, as if I'd somehow be safe behind their so-called protective measures. But I'd rather risk it all, dive headfirst into a digital abyss than let them erase the last remnants of my past. I protested, argued, even begged, and when that got me nowhere, I went quiet and resolved to keep my phone a secret from them, using it late at night, crouched under my blanket with the screen dimmed to avoid detection. I fell deeper into the rabbit hole of dark web forums and conspiracy theories, where like-minded souls gathered to share their secrets and fears, convincing myself that they understood the depths of my grief far better than anyone in my foster home ever could. On those sleepless nights, I discovered far more than I ever wanted to know, stories of people who had lost loved ones, tales of sinister disappearances, and whispers of a dark underbelly that thrived in the forgotten corners of the internet. I didn't realize how consumed I was becoming until I encountered a user named Shad0W who claimed he could help people cross over and re-establish contact with the dead using only technology. I was skeptical but intrigued by this account. He had a strange allure, a quiet confidence that drew me in like a moth to a flame. I began engaging with his posts, my curiosity overriding my alarm bells, convinced that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to communicate with my parents again, to hear their voices one last time. Shed0W claimed he needed a special device, the type of thing used in the old ghost hunting shows and a few creepy YouTube channels. I had never considered going beyond my phone, but Shed0W assured me that he had the secrets to make my iPhone a portal, a tether to the world I lost touch with. With his encouragement, I snuck out one moonless night to grab the necessary supplies, a broken radio, a battery pack, and several wires from the old electronics my foster parents tossed out. I felt a thrill run through me as I pieced it together in my room, convinced that while the world saw darkness, I was simply on the brink of a glorious rebirth. As I wrapped the last wire around the makeshift contraption, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I set everything up, my heart thumping loudly in my chest, hoping this wouldn't just be another wild goose chase. I wanted to believe it would bring me closure. As the clock struck midnight, I opened a chat window with Shad0W, typing frantically, my fingers almost slipping over the screen from the sweat of my anticipation. He told me to make a noise, anything, and focus on the memories I still cherished, the laughter of my real mother and the promises of my father echoing like whispers in my mind. I followed his instructions, my breath hitching as I began to hum a lullaby my mother used to sing. And then, as I held my breath waiting for something, anything, the air around me crackled to life. At first, it was silence, and I thought I was being foolish, but then the radio I'd fashioned let out a high-pitched squeal that made me recoil, and the lights flickered as if responding to my intentions. My phone screen began to blur, the images of my parents rippling like reflections in disturbed water. Suddenly, I heard static, followed by indistinct voices, growing louder and clearer. It was my mother's laughter and my father's deep chuckle weaving together in a painful symphony. I reached out, desperate to bridge the gap, to connect to the only family I'd ever truly felt was mine. As I continued to hum, the voices grew frantic, and an icy chill crawled up my spine, a sense of urgency twisting in my gut. And then, just like that, a voice that wasn't my mother's erupted through the static. "Stop it. Please stop." It was low, plaintive, almost begging, and the warmth of hope quickly twisted into something far more sinister. I felt bile rise in my throat as the tone shifted, becoming furious, accusing me as if it were a vengeful spirit. "You're not supposed to be here." My heart raced, dread pulsing through me as I realized I might have done something horribly wrong, awakening something I could never comprehend. I tried to pull back, to disconnect, but I was paralyzed as shadows began to stretch along the walls, writhing and shifting like dark bile. I could feel their icy breath on the back of my neck, whispers flooding my ears, growing louder. "You're not family. You're not family." Fleeing into panic, I threw my phone across the room, shattering the fragile link, the echoes of their fury clawing at my skin. The shadows receded, leaving nothing but an oppressive silence, but the scar of that encounter would never vanish. I stumbled into the living room in a haze, my heart still pounding as I faced my foster parents, who woke up alarmed by the commotion. Their eyes widened as they saw me, trembling and wide-eyed, and for the first time, I felt the weight of their concern, genuine and terrified, yet I could hardly stand it. They immediately gathered around me, asking questions I didn't know how to answer, probing for an explanation of what had transpired in the dark corners of my mind. I wanted to scream that it wasn't my fault, that I had desperately sought solace and instead summoned only trouble, but the words stuck in my throat. The fear in their eyes stung like 1,000 needles, and just like that, I realized I had no choice. I had insulted my own reality, tearing apart the fragile threads of stability they had attempted to weave around me. As they held me, their warmth was suffocating instead of comforting. It only reminded me of the loss, the real family lost in shadows and confusion. I didn't want them probing deeper, I didn't want to tell them what happened. But that night turned from chaos to something else. It morphed into quiet nights full of investigations into my behavior, full of therapy openness and communication strategies over therapy sessions. They came to discover the extent of my misadventures on the internet and decided to enforce parental controls, the very thing I had fought against, drowning me in an irony bitter enough to make me sick. With each layer they placed on my phone, I felt not protected, but restrained, confined within the walls of their good intentions, a prisoner to their version of safety. My biological family was gone and unreplaceable, and somehow, my foster family turned from bastions of hope into an extension of confinement. I began to wonder, AITA, for trying to cling to the last pieces of my past, for wanting a connection that, as the dreadful echoes of that night reminded me, perhaps ought to remain severed, void of voices calling from the dark. I never thought I would end up here, bleeding my emotions onto the screen as I try to make sense of it all and decide if I'm the one in the wrong. Just last week, I fainted in my kitchen, the gritty tile floor rushing to meet me, but the heart of my pain sat just a few feet away in the form of my mother, an unyielding fortress of misunderstanding. It felt like I'd stepped into a twisted reality where my cries for help fell on deaf ears, and all that mattered was her dismissive belief that I was faking it for attention. I had never felt so betrayed. The world had dimmed, and in that instant, I thought I was fading away into an abyss that no one would care to follow me into. My vision blurred, then darkened, but I could feel the roughness of the floor beneath my cheek and hear the low thump of my heart battling against unconsciousness. When the world began to spin back into focus, I struggled to lift my head, and there she was, my mother, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, only interested in making her nightly casserole than in the gaping wound I had in my soul. "You're just pretending to get attention," she said, her voice thick with irritation. I wanted to scream, to tell her the truth, that I had battled anxiety for years, that my heart felt as if it were about to rip through my chest, that I felt truly unreal, like a ghost drifting through the people I loved. But there was no understanding reflected back at me, only the sharpness of her words cutting deeper with every breath I took. For a long moment, we were locked in a silent battle, her convinced that my struggles were merely a performance, while I struggled to prove that my reality was real, that I was standing on the edge of a cliff with the darkest depths beneath me and her scorn pushing me closer to the edge. It was just a few weeks before I had sat across from her at the kitchen table, trying to explain the weight in my chest, how the walls felt as if they were closing in, how I sometimes couldn't breathe, and instead of empathizing, she pointed her fork at me, a jeering light in her eyes, declaring that I had too much time on my hands, that I was just perpetually unhappy. I'd done everything I could to break through to her, gentlemen's letters and gentle nudges that fell flat, like trying to lift an anchor with sheer determination alone. She would ignore the trembling in my hands, the tears that fell silently, the way I'd collapse into numbness after a panic attack, and she'd always find an excuse to blame my moods on anything but what was truly happening inside my head. While I lay there that day, moaning on the floor, I felt resentment transform into rage. I couldn't believe she would act like this in my moment of need, her disdain a heavy anvil shackled to my consciousness as I finally pushed myself off the ground, my eyes meeting hers with a pleading desperation that only fueled her disdain further. "You didn't even bother to check if I was okay," I eventually shouted, the anguish leaking from my voice. "You think I'm just faking? Can't you see I'm in pain?" But she stood her ground, her face a mask of stubbornness and defiance as she retorted, "You're just looking for drama. Stop being so overdramatic." Those words cut deeper than any blade ever could. It was like a reflex, that aching feeling of abandonment, the urge to recoil and hide from someone I longed to trust, but I was trapped in this harsh reality. My stomach twisted in knots as the anger morphed into something darker within me, unforgivable rage mixed with heartbreak as I stared into her cold eyes and thought about all the nights I spent crying in the dark, pleading for someone to understand. It was the moment I realized that I had to fight against the truth that felt carved into my bones, that love can be two-edged, and sometimes, the very people who are supposed to support and understand you are the ones who are too quick to turn away. Time stretched then, laden with heavy silence, until I stumbled towards my bedroom, the weight of her misunderstanding an anchor that dragged behind me. I locked the door and collapsed onto my unkempt bed, letting the frustration seep out with furious sobbing as I thought about how little she truly understood me. It was as if every time I reached for clarity, she was there to snatch it away, and I was left floating in a vast sea of confusion. That night, I clutched my chest and felt every beat like a distant echo. I stayed up, staring at the ceiling, praying for some sign, any sign, that my mother could hear me over those hollow corridors that separated us. Every rebuttal echoed in my mind until a sobering realization washed over me. Perhaps she was not just blind to my torment, but maybe it was easier for her to rationalize my struggles as mere theatrics than to confront the truth of my internal battles, the stark reality of mental illness that crawled beneath my skin like a restless spirit. I thought of reaching for my phone, posting about how words can wound more than any physical ailment ever could, but in weighing my pain against the potential backlash, I opted for silence. In the days that followed, a storm brewed in our household, tension-lacing conversations as if each word trembled in the weight of unspoken grief. I was still tender, raw from the contempt I felt from her. I wanted to scream, to write everything I felt in the hopes she would finally cradle my heart in her hands, understand the bitter truth that a child's pleas can echo endlessly into the void. But every time I looked into her eyes, all I saw was the reflection of the disbelief. I often wondered if she'd ever truly recognized the scars hidden under a simple facade. Finally, a week later, another fainting spell struck, harder this time. A great wave of blackness, panic surging within me, the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. I hit the floor again, and as my consciousness flickered and danced dangerously close to the edge, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this time she would hear me. Maybe she would change. But when I regained composure, I found her at the door, a storm brewing in her eyes. "Not this again." I blinked away the haze of the sudden blackout, but her words felt like chains already binding me down, wretched chains forged from her disbelief. I heard her footsteps retreating down the hall, leaving me once again left to wrestle with demons that had become so familiar in the stillness that followed. Maybe I was faking it all, maybe this was just an elaborate play for attention, and I was the fool who couldn't keep up the act. But as darkness loomed over me, I knew I would rather face my fears alone than be misunderstood by the very person who should have had my back. In those silent moments, I bore the burden of my brokenness, a fragile entity yearning for brightness like a blooming flower desperate for sun, ready to wilt under the weight of unmet needs. I wish I could say that I woke up one day with the answers, that somehow, my mother would grasp the truth locked within my heart and walk beside me as I traveled through this bewildering labyrinth of human emotion. Instead, I began to learn to understand what it meant to be both the lost child and the one seeking the truth untouched by doubt, as I realized that sometimes the greatest battles we fight are not against our illness, but against the shadows cast by those who refuse to meet us in the light. I've always been protective of my belongings, especially my expensive headphones. They were a gift from my grandfather before he passed, and they're not just headphones, they're a piece of my history, my sanctuary. Living in a small, cramped apartment with my roommate, Jenna, had its challenges, especially when it came to boundaries. Jenna was charming in her own right, a free spirit, a whirlwind of messy hair and bright laughter that could fill a room, but she also had a way of pushing my limits, always borrowing things without asking and then somehow convincing me it was totally okay. A few months ago, she borrowed my headphones for the first time, saying her own had broken, and though I had reservations, I couldn't say no when she gave me that pleading look. But when I noticed the small scratches on the ear pads upon their return, my stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and sadness. It felt like she was borrowing not just my headphones but part of my soul, and every damage was a betrayal. Weeks passed, and I resolved to keep the headphones locked up whenever I left the apartment, but last Friday, she approached me with her typical sunny smile, asking to borrow them just for a quick session. I hesitated, feeling that familiar unease wash over me. "Please, just for a couple of hours. I promise I'll be super careful." But recalling the state they had returned in last time, I couldn't help but instinctively shake my head. The conversation escalated. She accused me of being selfish and paranoid, and while she ranted, I felt my heart race, my mind racing as I tried to explain the value of that gift, but my words fell upon deaf ears. It spiraled into a shouting match, and I was ready to slam the door against her face just to feel vindicated for standing my ground. But when night fell and I thought I would have the space to breathe, something felt off. As I lay in bed, the silence of the apartment grew oppressive, and a creeping sense of dread settled over me. The moment I heard the unmistakable click of the door opening, my heart stopped. I glanced at my phone, 2:13 a.m. I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but the soft sound of something sliding against the hardwood floor got louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of my headphones being moved. I shot out of bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Peeking around the corner into the dimly lit living room, I saw Jenna hunched over my desk, glancing back nervously, her fingers intertwined with the cords of my headphones, the terrible glint of defiance in her eyes. "I know you're up. It's just a pair of headphones," she hissed, her tone laced with an eerie calmness that sent chills down my spine. I could have chosen to scream, to lash out or call her out, but something deep within me made me instinctively choose a cold silence, watching eerily as she continued to act like a thief in the night. An unsettling rush washed over me. I knew then that this wasn't about the headphones, this was a battle of wills, and I had no intention of losing. "You think I'm just going to let you take them?" I finally managed to whisper, breaking our shared silence, my voice low enough to shake among the shadows. The moment stretched into an eternity as her eyes widened in surprise, but then, to my horror, a sinister smile crept across her face, as though she relished being challenged. "You need to lighten up, you really do," she said, her voice becoming mocking, each word dripping with disdain. "The world won't end if you just let go a little." I felt a fire spark in my chest, booting my fight or flight instincts into high gear, as I stepped out into the living room, the shadows closing in around me like a predator ready to pounce. "You're not taking them from me, Jenna," I said, now resolute. Her confusion morphed into anger, and in return, I felt an unnatural strength overcome me. It was almost like I was possessed by a vengeful spirit teaching me the gravity of self-defense. Just as she reached for the headphones, I lunged, gripping her wrist tightly as I felt the aura shift between us, transforming the air into ice. After a tense grapple, she finally shoved me away, stumbling back, and in that moment, something terrifying happened. The lights flickered, casting a creepy shadow against the walls, dancing as if mirroring our turmoil. "You don't understand what you're asking for," she whispered, her voice suddenly trembling. "You don't know what happens when you refuse someone something they want." The atmosphere became thick with unsung words. My pulse quickened, every rational thought screaming for me to vacate the situation, but I was locked in, eyes wide as Jenna approached me, menacingly, almost hypnotically. "You think this was just about the headphones? You're clueless, and now," she leaned closer until I could smell her panic and desperation, "now you're in the way." Before I could react, the faint blare of my headphones crackled to life, pulling me out of her chaotic hold. Colors swirled as if the universe had reset. I closed my eyes, feeling the world spin, a haunting whisper flooding my senses, "You should have let me borrow them." As the sound overtook me, I realized too late that I had not only lost my headphones but perhaps something far more precious, my peace of mind. I bolted from the apartment, not daring to look back, propelling me through the night air and into the unknown, knowing I could never step foot back in there again. Because sometimes, the people we trust the most harbor darkness just waiting for the slightest chance to uncover itself, and sometimes, in refusing something that feels insignificant, you find that you've awakened something truly terrifying lurking just beneath the surface. When my husband, Mark, met Tyler at the gym, I thought it was harmless. I was glad to see him making a new friend after years of long nights working his sales job. But as their friendship blossomed, spontaneous workouts, late-night phone calls, and weekend outings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become a ghost in my own home, a specter hovering over what used to be our strong family unit, especially as our family tradition of Sunday dinners began to wither like a neglected plant. It felt foreign, like watching someone else take my place at the head of the table where we once laughed and shared stories. I tried to be supportive, reminding him of our Sunday gatherings that had anchored us through both good and bad times, but each time I brought it up, he brushed me off with a half-hearted, "We can do it next week." Weeks turned into months, and soon we were only eating dinner together when he was too tired to go out with Tyler. My frustration turned into resentment. I tried confronting him, but every time I mentioned how much our tradition meant to me, Mark threw in an eye roll as if I were an old-fashioned relic, stuck in a past he had outgrown. The Sundays I had cherished turned into silent nights filled with cold pasta and leftover memories, and though I hoped he would see how much I was suffering, it felt like I was speaking into a void. That's when everything changed. Tyler invited us out to a fancy restaurant downtown, and Mark, without checking with me, enthusiastically accepted, trying to mask the guilt beneath his excitement. I had reached a tipping point by then. The idea of my family tradition being outclassed by what I saw as a fleeting friendship snapped something inside me. I told Mark, absolutely desperate for his attention, that I wanted him to prioritize our family traditions over this new friendship, but instead of seeing my pain, he exploded in frustration, accusing me of being controlling and jealous of his friendships, hurling words like selfish and old-fashioned at me like daggers. On that fateful Sunday, when he chose to go out with Tyler instead of coming home for the traditional meal we'd wrestled to prepare together, I felt an icy grip clench around my heart. Alone in the kitchen, I meticulously set the table for a family that no longer existed in the way I longed for it to. When the clock ticked past the hour we would typically start eating, shadowy memories whipped around me, our kids giggling as they waged food fights, Mark's booming laugh filling the air, the sweet smell of garlic bread wafting through the house as though it were the very essence of our shared life. Then, as if on cue, a knock echoed through the silence, startling me. When I answered, I was met not with Mark and his sly smirk but with Tyler, who wore an expression of shame and good intention that I couldn't quite place. He stood there, holding a large bouquet of lifeless flowers and an empty food container marked takeout. Ty. I felt a rush of emotions crash inside me. Anger, confusion, and a deep sorrow riveted my resolve, but before I could identify one coherent thought, he started to speak. Mark had this at the restaurant, told me he'd be home soon, but... He trailed off, looking remorseful while guilt oozed from his body like sweat after a long workout. And just like that, I realized that I was not just losing Mark but all the warmth the family held had crumbled like decaying leaves. Tyler's voice trembled as he said, he wanted to keep going with our friendship, but I didn't know you were feeling this way when I invited him. With Tyler standing there, I felt every sunbeam of hope vanish, the air thickening with unspoken truths. He didn't even understand. How could he? Mark had grown so entranced by this new life that the shadows of our past had intruded upon my very soul. When I finally raised my voice, I felt emboldened, accusing them both of neglect and disrespect. You think friendship's easy, but family is built on something deeper. It's respect, loyalty, and moments shared over years. You can't just glamorize a flicker and let it drown out a flame, I shouted, voice cracking, losing its strength as Tyler seemed to shrink before me, a boy caught in the crossfire of a battle he never wanted to join. I just wanted him to have fun, he muttered, eyes cast downward. I didn't mean to hurt you. I felt a torrent of emotions bubble inside me. Deep down, I knew Tyler was merely a conduit for a chasm that had formed between Mark and me, rooted in neglect and bitterness. Suddenly, the door swung open, and Mark stepped in, laughter echoing against the walls, jangling like bells on a frayed wire. He paused, taking in the sight before him, me, standing defensively, Tyler looking about ready to fold in on himself, and suddenly it struck me that I had become the villain in this narrative. What's going on? Mark asked, the laughter draining from his voice. I stood there, trembling, feeling immeasurable anger but also a pain of desperation as I fought to find the right words. Mark, you're losing us. The syllables formed a shaky confession laden with heartache, and it was as if the room began to tilt, shadows shifting ominously as the truth of my pain spilled out into the open air. In that agonizing moment, vulnerability consumed me, and I saw Mark's face crack open, confusion swirling with realization. Could we claw our way back to the shared memories we used to laugh about like old friends? Could he embrace our tradition instead of dismissing it for something ephemeral? Silence fell heavy between us, and I knew we were all standing precariously on the edge of a broken promise, one thread still connecting us to the flaking facade of our home life, closely adhered to a memory that was slowly being eroded by the tide of indifference. I used to think conflicts in marriage were easy to resolve. After all, how hard could it be to express your feelings about something that's bothering you? But that was before the Fruit Loops incident, the night everything changed between my husband Eric and me. It began innocently enough. I was exhausted after a long day at work, and as I shuffled into the kitchen, I spotted Eric happily indulging in a massive bowl of cereal, the artfully vibrant loops smothered in milk, his face illuminated by the glow of the fridge light. I greeted him with a smile, expecting just a quiet moment to connect after a hectic day, but the atmosphere soured when I saw he already had a second bowl prepared, as if realizing he'd need it to satiate some insatiable hunger I didn't even know he had. My initial amusement turned to annoyance as he spooned a heaping helping into his mouth, the sound of the cereal crunching echoing in the dimly lit kitchen, like a cruel remix of my own spiraling frustration. "Are you really going to eat that much?" I asked, trying to inject a hint of humor into my comment, but Eric shot me a glare that poured ice down my spine. "What? It's just cereal," he replied, voice tinged with defensiveness as if I'd accused him of committing heinous acts. It struck me that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting, so I shrugged it off and made myself a much smaller bowl, but the unease lingered like a ghost I couldn't shake. I sat across from him, and we could barely look at each other as the silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of spoons and slurping milk, hollow reminders of our widening disconnect. Trying to break the suffocating tension, I suggested we talk about our days, sharing a story about a coworker's mishap that had everyone in stitches, but Eric nodded in response, his focus unwavering from the bowl as if I were speaking an entirely different language. I could feel rage bubbling beneath my skin, a helplessness morphing into something primal, and I couldn't help but feel he was deliberately ignoring me. Finally, in a moment of clarity wrapped in a shroud of frustration, I blurted out, "It's kind of selfish to hog all the cereal, you know." Silence ensued. Eric's spoon clattered against the bowl, the sound sending a shockwave through my chest. "Selfish? You think eating a bowl of cereal makes me selfish?" he asked incredulously, his voice rising, anger twisting his features into something I almost didn't recognize. I was tired. "Just because I want to enjoy my food doesn't mean I'm putting myself before you." The atmosphere became thick with unsaid words. I felt a reservoir of tears threaten to spill over, and I wasn't sure why I felt so shut out. My unease blossomed into outright confusion because it was just cereal, wasn't it? What did it even mean when we hurled accusations back and forth like cold cuts at a deli, the oddity of the situation spiraling toward an absurd conclusion? "You're making a big deal out of nothing, Eric," spat, indignant, and for a fleeting second, his ire glanced off my armor of hurt. Perhaps I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But then came a wave of bitterness that I couldn't ignore. Wasn't this about more than Fruit Loops? It was about our relationship, the chasm that had grown between us, countless nights of silence more poignant than words, several missed connections disguised as life's daily grind. I felt utterly alone in my desire to bridge that gap, a rhythmic pulse pounding in my ears as he continued to scoff at my words, chewing through each syllable as if they were the very cereal he deemed more important than our conversation. The bowl became a battleground as I accused him of being neglectful, focusing on superficial things instead of the underlying issues that screamed for attention. "If I can't even talk to you about our basic needs, who am I to share my life with you?" I felt raw, exposed, like a creature caught in the harsh light of his casual apathy, but he refused to budge, scoffing as he dug into another helping, the brightly colored pieces swimming in milk, blissfully unaware of the maelstrom of emotions swirling just a few inches away. I got up, slammed my bowl in the sink, and stomped toward our bedroom, where the weight of my words loomed over me. I slumped against the door, trying to catch my breath as I felt the tears tumble down my cheeks. Am I the entitled one here? The nagging voice inside me echoed as guilt washed over like a tidal wave. But rather than reflecting on my own pain, I wondered if he could truly remain indifferent while the world burned around him. This was more than cereal. It was the way he could eat so blithely while ignoring the hollow sounds of our lives barely touched by intimacy. Hours passed, my thoughts spiraled until they felt tangible, raw like a wound, and when I heard the soft patter of his footsteps creeping toward our bedroom, I thought maybe we could reconcile. But instead, Eric stood at the threshold, and before I could even summon a calm demeanor, he mumbled something unintelligible that sounded much like an apology but felt entirely hollow, just a way to end the night without earnestness. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, shame shimmering briefly only to collapse under the weight of his pride. I muttered something back, words soaked in resentment, and, in that moment, in that oh-so-ordinary kitchen illuminated with memories and the smell of fading milk, I realized his dinner was more than a bowl of cereal. It had come to symbolize everything gnawing at us beneath the surface, the inability to dig deeper, the hesitance to face what was truly wrong. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, allowing exhaustion to wash over me, yet sleep eluded as I replayed the events of the night like a reel in slow motion. In that ache of solitude, I understood something crucial. It wasn't about cereal anymore, it was about feeling unseen. The next morning was a chilly void of unspoken words. You could cut the tension with a knife as neither of us acknowledged what had transpired. Eric settled back into his routine, stepping lightly with precise purpose, brewing coffee while I poured cereal, determining to trudge forward despite the weight of resentment. Should I have bitten my tongue? Should I have just let him indulge? But beneath that question lurked a deeper one: was I wrong for wanting recognition? Days turned into weeks, and while practical matters continued as they always did, I felt the shift, how we danced around each other more carefully, like two actors performing in a play where the audience was unaware of the tension building offstage. I found solace in the quiet of night when I could replay our childish skirmish, flesh and blood memories tinged with bitterness, wondering if we were just prolonging the inevitable, forcing ourselves through to the end of a dull script. And then, one evening, as I flicked through Netflix in a desperate bid to create a new shared experience, I offered to make dinner. Maybe my gesture would be perceived as an olive branch. But after gathering ingredients and cooking a meal for two, I hesitantly beckoned Eric to our table, fiery lights dancing against the walls, and proposed we eat together instead of watching another episode without so much as a glance or a word exchanged. He looked up, reluctance flickering across his face as he joined me, but the table was a quiet battlefield once again, simmering words lingering in the corners of our postures. I couldn't hold back the flood anymore, all those hidden truths threatening to explode, the silence we'd sustained too long wrapped around our throats. You know, I called you selfish for a reason because you're not the only one hurting here, I said, heart racing, pouring out my frustration, and finally giving way to the aching loneliness I felt. His brow furrowed as if I had disturbed some old, long-buried pain. When he finally spoke, it was in a whisper laced with vulnerability. I didn't mean to shut you out. I thought Fruit Loops would fill a void. I didn't realize I had created another. In that moment, I understood what we'd both been trying to stave off: the hurt, the apathy, the mounting discontent. But what terrified me more than the fight over a bowl of cereal was the recognition that maybe the things we felt compelled to fight over were only reflections of the storms brewing beneath the surface. And that night, instead of cereal becoming our destruction, it transformed into something unexpected, an offering of understanding, a chance to heal the wounds left festering in the shadows. We each took a slice of the truth, and through the darkness, the glow of hope started to dance in the periphery, a tiny flicker promising that even the smallest battles could become the beginning of something new. And as we sat there, spooning in unison, I realized sometimes it takes a bowl of cereal to really see each other again. It was just supposed to be a casual night in with my friends, sitting on the couch while we binge-watched old horror movies and made jokes about the cheesy effects, but everything shifted when Lynn, my closest friend, leaned in with a mischievous grin and said, "You know, watching you two is like watching a really intricate roleplay," and for a split second, I started laughing, not because I thought it was true, who would seriously think that? But more because the idea struck me as absurd, like something ripped from the pages of a bad fanfiction. My boyfriend, Jake, chuckled too, more out of awkwardness than agreement, but when I looked at Lynn, her expression changed from playful to something darker, almost predator-like, and in that moment, I felt a chill skitter down my spine. I shrugged it off, dismissing it as one of her quirky comments at first, but the laughter died in the air, replaced by a heavy silence. I didn't realize it then, but my laugh had unearthed something buried deep within the group, like invoking a slumbering spirit at a seance. The night progressed, filled with laughter over bad jump scares and popcorn fights, but every so often, I'd catch Lynn staring at me through the flickering light of the TV, her gaze intense, almost conspiratorial. As the clock struck midnight, the final film ended, leaving echoes of creepy music lingering in the air, and we all decided to call it a night. I started cleaning up the mess, tossing empty snack bags into the trash while Jake and Lynn chatted in the corner, and I could tell something was off. Lynn's smile had morphed into a smirk, and I felt that familiar unease prick at my skin, a sense I couldn't quite shake. Later, as Jake and I were getting ready for bed, I joked about Lynn's comment, playfully nudging him, maybe we should, spice things up a bit? But he didn't laugh. Instead, he frowned, his brow furrowing. What did you mean by that? He asked, and I felt a rush of confusion. Wasn't we on the same page? I told him I was kidding, but then he shifted closer, scanning my face. You didn't take her seriously, did you? The weight of his gaze pierced through me, and a strange dread curled in the pit of my stomach as I denied it, even as I recalled the glint in Lynn's eyes. The next day, Lynn's texts were as animated as always, but beneath the surface, I could sense something off, like frayed wires on a live circuit. When I met up with her later, I tried to broach the subject lightly, but she dismissed my concern, her laughter ringing too loud, too haunting. The following months became a looping nightmare, where I'd catch Lynn watching me with an intensity that made my heart race, each encounter steeped in an unsettling tension I couldn't comprehend. I'd hear whispers behind my back, hushed tones between Jake and Lynn whenever I left the room, and Jake had begun to change too, his jovial demeanor shadowed by an underlying paranoia that echoed my own. Our intimate conversations grew strained, and he started to echo my own worries back at me. Was Lynn really just a friend, or had I become a pawn in their twisted game? The realization that Lynn had crossed a boundary I didn't fully grasp gripped me like a vice, and unease morphed into outright dread as I pieced together that her ramblings about roleplay might not have been innocent at all. One fateful night, driven by a mix of fear and determination, I decided I had to confront Lynn. I needed to know what was going on behind her mask of friendship. I invited her over, pretending to keep the atmosphere light, yet when she arrived, I could feel the storm brewing beneath our pleasantries, her laughter shrill and forced as I coiled my fists against my trembling legs. What did you really mean when you said we were role-playing? I pressed, and her expression flipped from playful to predatory, the corners of her mouth curling into that tight-lipped smile I'd come to dread. Oh honey, she said, her voice sickly sweet, you're the one playing a part, but the script was never given to you. You're just too naive to see it. My heart raced as I felt the air grow thick with something so palpable, it bordered on tangible. Every warning bell I had ignored screamed in my head, and I tried to excuse myself, to reclaim my sanity, but as I turned to the door, I could hear her murmuring my name, each syllable laced with something darker. The following week twisted into a surreal nightmare. I started to see shadows cast from my past interactions with both women seep through the cracks of my whitewashed reality, memories warped and rewritten. I catch Jake staring blanks at his phone, brow furrowed, whispers weaving like spider silk between Lynn's oddly timed texts and his own responses, and the intimacy we had shared dwindled to cold, vacant exchanges. I tried talking to him about it, about how Lynn was siphoning energy between us like we were puppets strung along by her whims, but each time, he'd grow defensive, lashing out as if my concerns were unfounded, and I found myself backed into a corner, racked with doubt, as if I was losing both my boyfriend and my own sense of reality. On a particularly agonizing night, exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed into a restless sleep, plagued by eerie dreams where I was an actor trapped in a puppet show, a caged bird pecked at by invisible threads pulling me into darker depths. I awoke with a start, and for a fleeting moment, the haze of the dream lingered, and I felt compelled to check my messages. The screen glowed eerie in the dark, and as I scrolled through the texts, dread coiled like a serpent around my heart when I discovered an unexpected text from Jake, "Meet me at the old playground," and the timestamp sent a shiver down my spine. It was sent during the night while I'd been dreaming. My heart pounded in my chest as questions overwhelmed me. Had they been plotting against me? What role had I been cast in? I grabbed my keys, driven by an impulse that propelled me forward, the shadows closing in like a muffled silence. The playground loomed in the distance, cloaked in darkness, and each step felt heavy, weighed down by foreboding whispers. As I arrived, the air turned thick and clammy, veiled in a chilling mist that whispered my name. Jake. I called, but the night swallowed my voice whole. I turned, searching every silhouette under the moonlight, and then I saw her, Lynn, standing there, and in a heartbeat, I froze, terror gripping my throat as I felt an icy blast of realization. It wasn't Jake waiting for me, it was her, and the glint in her eyes confirmed the role I had unknowingly stepped into was far from innocent. "You finally made it," she said, her voice a twisted serenade that shattered my resolve. "I've been waiting for you." The darkness enveloped me, and I was left suspended in a nightmarish tableau, understanding too late that the laughter I once shared had been merely the haunting echo of a sinister game I never wished to play. I never thought refusing to babysit my niece would lead to such a haunting series of events, but here I am, fingers trembling over my keyboard, desperate to share what transpired. It all began with a simple family gathering, my heart warm from the laughter and the clinking of glasses, until my sister, Lily, confronted me. She didn't care for the way I brought my boyfriend, Jake, around. She said it was inappropriate, like a circus show crashing into a serene family picnic. I was blindsided, and feeling cornered, I snapped, telling her that I wouldn't stand for her judgmental attitude and her constant need to control who I bring into our family's space. She retaliated by demanding I babysit her kids that weekend, as if promising to take care of her children hinged on my compliance. I returned home in a rage, refusing to justify myself further. A cloud of tension hung over my mind, but I convinced myself it was just typical family drama and that things would blow over. However, that very night, I received a call from my brother-in-law, frantic and nearly incoherent. He said something had happened, that the kids weren't behaving, and Lily was off the deep end. Wordlessly, I felt the shadow of dread creep in. It turned out he was wrong. Lily had taken the kids to a local fair, and when she didn't come back, well, the phone calls began flooding in. Hours stretched into what felt like an eternity, my stomach knotting more tightly with each unanswered ring, until they found her car abandoned in the parking lot, the engine still warm, and the haunting echoes of laughter from the carnival turned into sirens and chaos. It was only after frantic searches that they found her 3 blocks away, screaming at the top of her lungs, but not for help. She was screaming at her kids, who stood there, petrified with wide eyes and trembling limbs. The problem? She claimed she had seen something dark and lurking, something that she insisted was trying to get them. It wasn't just a skit, it was real to her. The way she talked about it, like it was a relentless predator stalking the shadows, had everyone on edge. It landed her in a psychiatrist's office, the official diagnosis being acute stress reaction. She could no longer care for her kids without assistance, and that's when the guilt hit me like a freight train. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I should have just sucked it up and done my part while juggling my own feelings about Jake. Instead, I'd stood my ground like some stubborn rock while she spiraled into the unknown. It didn't help that the kids became more withdrawn. They wouldn't speak about the fair or even look me in the eye anymore. So, feeling responsible, I offered to step in on weekend babysitting duties to support her recovery, but the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with unfinished chords that resonated unanswered questions. I began to notice strange things happening during these sessions. The kids would stare at empty corners of the room, whispering things I couldn't hear. Their faces turned pale as if they saw memories of something wicked, and one evening, while I was trying to distract them with movies, I caught them doodling in their coloring books. One innocent scrawl read, "It saw us." I brushed it aside, chalking it up to vivid imaginations, but then I heard soft thumps coming from upstairs when nothing was up there. My heart raced. I pushed through the fear, convincing myself it was old house creaks. But when the children's laughter turned to sobs, and they refused to go near the window, I decided I needed to confront this terrifying new reality. There was a lingering chill each night, and as I'd watch the kids fall asleep, I'd scour every inch of the house trying to find traces of what had stolen their joy. Then one night, while flipping through channels with the twins snuggled under blankets, a local news report caught my attention, a witness account claiming in the area, and I swear to you, it was the exact description of what my sister had said she saw. Something with long fingers and a grotesque face that would make shadows tremble. Feeling sickened, I dismissed it as coincidence but couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. I called Lily, her voice muffled and terrified, begging me not to let the kids go outside alone, and suddenly, everything spiraled out of my control. I thought I was doing good by stepping in, but it only worsened. The kids' nightmares turned real, and they refused to stay in their rooms, screaming about the thing in the shadows whenever night fell. I tried to reassure them, but all they could talk about was how it knew where they were and how it wanted to take them. Every night, I'd hear the soft whispering and see shadows darting past the corners of my vision. I was sleepless, frantic, and terrified. Months went by and therapy didn't help Lily, and when I finally stole a moment to lay out everything that happened to my boyfriend, Jake, he listened, shaken but resolute, telling me we'd investigate the house. The moment we walked into that living room, I caught Jake watching the children out of the corner of his eye, murmuring, "It's just an illusion." I had hoped he was right. I couldn't bear the thought of the monstrous beliefs consuming my family. So one evening, armed with only a flashlight, we ventured through the attic, but all we found were old boxes and dusty memories until an unearthly silence hung in the air. I flipped the switch, and together, we felt the temperature drop, hardly a breath could be heard, and suddenly those whispers kicked in more clearly. In sharp clarity, I felt it wash over me, an overwhelming sense of dread cementing my feet to the floor, and Jake jerked back, his face paling as he swept the beam across the shadows. And there it was, lurking in the edges, a twisted shape standing tall, fingers stretching impossibly long towards us. I wanted to scream. My instincts yelled to run, to grab the kids and flee, but in that moment, terror froze us in time. The thing whispered a name, my sister's name, and I realized then that it had wanted her all along, wanting to drag her into its world of darkness. That's when I heard my niece's voice, soft, innocent, and oh so familiar, calling me from downstairs, begging me to come play. I snapped awake from my horror, clutching my boyfriend's arm, and somehow rushed down the stairs, screaming for the kids to get away from the windows, but the room was empty. Silence smothered me alive, and when we managed to tear ourselves outside, a suffocating realization washed over me: the children were gone. Lily, lost in her own hell, and my family fracturing from the inside out, while the shadows grew ever longer. So now I sit here, sleepless, haunted, wrapped in both guilt and unanswered questions, because the thing that took my niece, that thing that chased echoes across our lives, had started as a mere judgment at a party, spiraling into a nightmare I never wanted to be a part of. AITA for refusing to babysit when I had no clue it would unravel into a much darker unfolding?